This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Kathrani, and I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Westminster. And it's my pleasure to be called today to chair this second seminar in the seminar series Psychology and Refugee Protection, jointly organised by the Refugee Law Initiative, based here at the School of Advanced Studies, and the Centre for the Study of Emotion and Law. The principal objective of this seminar series is to bring together the two different disciplines of refugee law and psychology, and to see how both of them can inform each other. How can psychology inform refugee law and vice versa? And personally, I think this has at least two benefits. Often when it comes to refugee law, there is a tendency to take a very doctrinal or black letter approach to it. But if one thing that refugee law teaches us, it's not just about the law. It's not just about what the convention says, what domestic law says, what statutes say, and so forth. There's a human dimension to refugee law as well, of course. People who have fled persecution coming to another country for protection. And I think it's very important and indeed very useful for seminar series such as this to bring an extra perspective to refugee law. Certainly a human level of law, an area of law that touches upon human lives. But apart from informing doctrine, of course, refugee protection in general, when one thinks about what refugee protection is about, asylum seekers are those people who are, of course, persecuted in their countries of origin. There's an element of separation there. They become the other in their countries of origin because of persecution, and they flee looking for protection in other countries. But despite the fact that they come to other countries looking for protection, what you often find is that they become the other in their place of protection as well. So we have an element of double persecution there, so to speak. Persecution in their country of origin and persecution in the host state. And I think a psychological perspective can inform the way in which we perceive refugees and the way in which we afford them rights and the way in which we treat them. So I think a seminar like this is beneficial for at least two different perspectives. For refugee law as a body of doctrine and law, and refugee protection in general. As I mentioned, this is the second seminar in the series, Trauma and Refugee Integration. And it's my pleasure today to be joined by four distinguished speakers on the stage. Dr. Kate Thompson, Ms. Indira Kartalodzi, Mary Robertson, and Dr. Miriam Cherty, who will be presenting to you today. I'd like to give say a few brief words about each of our speakers today. Dr. Kate Thompson is a registered counselling psychologist, chartered with the British Psychological Society. Since 1997, Dr. Thompson has been working as a refugee support psychologist for the North East London NHS Foundation. She has published a number of relevant papers in this area, and prior to working with the foundation, Dr. Thompson worked overseas in Africa, in Liberia, the Ivory Coast, and in the refugee camps in Tanzania. She also spent 1 year as delegate for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Rwanda. Indira Kartalodzi is a director of the Chrysalis Family Futures, a social enterprise working in collaboration with charities and agencies to provide intensive support services to vulnerable families and children. Indira has 15 years of experience as a senior advice worker on welfare rights, housing and immigration for homeless families, migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. Originally from Kosovo, Indira arrived as a refugee herself in the UK in 1992. Mary Robertson is a consultant clinical psychologist and heads the Traumatic Stress Clinic, Camden and Islington NHS Foundation Trust. Prior to coming to the UK, Mary managed a trauma clinic at the Centre for the Study of Violence and reconciliation in South Africa. She has had extensive experience in working with trauma in a variety of settings and with diverse client groups. And our discussant for today, Dr. Miriam Cherty, joined the Institute for Public Policy Research in May 2009. Prior to this, she was a project coordinator at the Migrant and Refugee Community Forum, where she led on an oral history project on the Moroccan diaspora in the UK. Miriam also worked as a consultant and researcher on a number of European projects looking at the integration of ethnic minorities. She's also taught at the University of Sussex. I'm sure you all agree with me that we are very honoured to be in the presence of such distinguished speakers, and I'd like to thank them all for attending today to present. The format for today's seminar will be that Dr. Kate Thompson and Dira Cartazzoli will begin with a 20 to 30 minute presentation, which will involve video and a slide presentation. Then that will be followed by a further 30-minute presentation by Mary Robertson. Then I'll invite our discussant for today, Miriam Cherty, to respond to these presentations, and then I will open up the floor to questions and answers. So it gives me great pleasure to invite our first speakers, Dr. Kate Thompson and Dira Cartazzoli. Thank you.
Hi. My contribution for this seminar tonight and the discussion would be a short film which I recently made up from four individual interviews that I've done with asylum seekers and refugees who are already settled in the country. However, before I speak about the film, I'd like to say that as a refugee myself, I arrived in this country in 1992, which is a long time, and luckily I didn't have to go through the same policy as most refugees do now. I wasn't part of any integration processes or programs. I spoke the language, and I do remember that the most difficult times throughout the life that I had in the UK was the first 6 months when I wasn't allowed to work and when I wasn't allowed to use the resources that I had to contribute to the society. And through the years that I've worked with refugees, migrants and asylum seekers, the policy has shifted, has changed immensely. Migrants and refugees are portrayed in a very, very negative way. Apart from immigration policies and all heading towards the deterrence system, this is only my opinion, I see that more and more agencies who actually work with refugees and asylum seekers are shifting their services towards delivering an agenda that is designed by this government. On the interviews that I've done with people that in some way I've worked or know through my work, there are 5 people for which the short film is 5 minutes film, is made out of 4 individual interviews. So there's a couple from Ecuador who arrived in the UK in early 2000. There is a Bosnian refugee who arrived in the UK in 1994. And there is a Somali refugee, Jamila, who arrived in the UK in 2003. And Ntambe, who's a Congolese national, who arrived in the UK in 2000. There's 4 different stories, and it was very difficult to make a short film. Each story is very unique, and it's got lots to say. For example, in the situation of Jamila that you will see, she was a refugee in a camp in Dadaab, and she spoke with great fear about the experience that she had in the camp. And then she spoke about her experience coming to the UK with the help of her mother, who was already here. And when she arrived in the UK, she said she was told that she can't stay near her mother, who was the main support. So she was dispersed to Scotland, and where she was a subject of racial abuse and all the other things that go on when refugees are placed in one place. The story of Yasmin, who's a Bosnian refugee, he escaped when he was 17, so he was a minor when he arrived in the UK. But similar to my personal case, he was educated, he went to the school and he got a job, he was speaking English, and for him life was much easier. And then we go to the story of Ecuadorian nationals, William and Sylvia, who's completely different. Although their integration in the UK was a struggle, they still have problems with finding employment and doing things, using their own resources to survive. And I think the most horrible story is Ntambe, who's from Congolese. Unfortunately, his story was completely different. He was refused asylum in the UK. Then he ended up destitute after all the appeals has been exhausted. He was asked to sign at the immigration center, and later, and that pushed him to find a job. He was working illegally, and he was caught, put in prison for 8 months, and then after that 10 months in detention center. So I'm not going to speak a lot about that. I think the short film will tell the story itself. However, I've got individual interviews for those who are interested to see the whole story behind all of them.
I think it's
So I basically applied for asylum because I could go to my country. And that seemed like a very, very civilized process where I just went to home office, made an application myself. It was also visitors or anything like that.
And I went to the tender of my case, trial I appeared. End of 2002, they refused my case.
We visited my mom's house a couple of months, and we split with our work without considering going to school. I wasn't feel like free to do things.
It took a while actually to get any sort of decision as such, because I think that already at that time it was pretty backwards and things like that. But at the same time, I was entitled to things that only arrived my own sort of like asylum seekers are not these days, which is, I could get income support, I could also get housing benefits. And even though the process took a while to actually get any kind of like papers in the UK, I was getting extensions every 6 months or every 2 years, so it never seemed like something that was stopping me sort of like getting my life.
Immigration asked me to report to immigration center. The distance was almost 21 miles to Robertson to Seoul without anything at all, without transport, without accommodation. So I used to woke up every morning by 4 in the morning just to go to report to immigration center.
I used to work from 10 to 3 to 6 to 12. In that time, from 3 to 6, I have little time to break. In that time, I decided to go to school.
It was homeless. It was December. It's Christmas. capacity. And then after that, they say we bring in other people from Scotland. And I say, okay. We went about my bus, came 1 week setup. Then after that, they give her a house, 3-bedroom flat. I just all within Scotland.
But unfortunately, in 2009, we were arrested and sent to prison in 2010, January 2010. Then the judge was given 16 months in prison.
I think we can do many things here with papers. It changed, for me it changed for better. It's true that he cannot find a job, a permanent job, but I always see him like on his own company.
Just first day detention, my head is gone, so I was so depressed. I started to feel just suiting myself. Because I thought prison detention should be better than prison. I was wrong. Prison became better than detention.
I'm looking at him like that. Yeah. But I think he still needs to have a vision like that. I think he has to see like that.
When I finally understood what finally kind of like hit me, that yeah, this is my always probably the time when I got my passport, the UK passport, because I was like, oh, okay, now I'm a citizen of this country, and it's like I can travel.
I sometimes ask why really human being can do this to another human being? Why? I accept, I plead guilty, I done wrong, I work illegally. But I was doing that for surviving. I will pay tax. I accept I done wrong. You put me in prison. I done my sentence. But they still keep me in prison for 3 weeks. And then 10 months in detention. I done it 10 months. Even now, actually.
Right, good, that's working. It's actually really a pleasure to begin with the voices of the people that we're talking about for a change, instead of talking about people, but to hear from the people that are concerned. And one of the difficulties in this whole area is often recalling that you're talking about people here, and people just like oneself. Thank you, Indira. Obviously much more IT capable than me. That's right, there is. Oh, yes. That's it. So the way in which we've chosen to divide tonight really is to talk a little bit about the whole idea of having to have an integration policy, followed by Mary, who's going to present something about what happens when you try to help people integrate. But I think we wanted to start with thinking about whether it's really a policy that should apply to everybody. I mean, does everybody need to be integrated when they change country? Or are we just talking about something that might apply in a few cases? And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do today is to say, actually, I think there's a problem with talking about integration in terms of a policy that's applied to everybody who comes here as a refugee. I'm sure I can make this. How do I make it? Do that, and then I'll just press slide. Sorry, I'm so... Lovely, great stuff. Apologies for my lack of fluency. So what is integration? Always good to start with a definition. This is the Collins English Dictionary, the act of combining or adding parts to make a unified whole. And then probably what we're thinking of in this sense, the act of amalgamating a racial or religious group with an existing community. amalgamating. Interesting. But the number 3, which is called number 2 on my slide, the combination of previously racially segregated social facilities and to a non-segregated system is also relevant, and that's the famous integration policies that were in the United States in the 1960s, for example, where schools were desegregated. The Home Office has a slightly different definition, and I'm quoting here from a paper that they wrote in 2004, so it's a different Home Office under a different government now. But it's worth looking at this definition. An individual or group is integrated within a society when they achieve public outcomes within employment, housing, education, health, etc., which are the equivalent to those achieved within the wider host communities. When they are socially connected with members of a national, ethnic, cultural, religious or other community with which they identify, and with members of other communities, and with relevant services and functions of the state. And have sufficient linguistic competence and cultural knowledge and a sufficient sense of security and stability to confidently engage in that society in a manner consistent with shared notions of nationhood and citizenship. Sounds very nice, doesn't it? I just wonder how many of us feel that we are that integrated, even if we've been born in the UK and spent all our lives here. It does sound very integrated. But what's not to like? That sounds like a great thing. You know, if this was my experience of living in this country, probably a good thing, wouldn't it? Well, I think my argument with this whole idea really is that there are 3 areas in which it doesn't really make sense. And the first is probably the most important, which is it's actually fairly disingenuous to talk about integration when you have a deterrent agenda in immigration policy that's very well and clearly demonstrated. What we heard in that film, which I thought was so interesting, was that people, when they got their papers, that's when they felt integrated. When Jasmine says, when I got my passport, that's when I felt like I lived here. You can do many things here with papers. On the other hand, when you don't have papers, you're liable to things like detention, which are really problematic, and you can hear that from the statements made. The other point I'd like to make is whether these integration strategies that come about through these integration policies could actually hold people back in finding their own way forward in life. And finally, I want to make a point about who this integration strategy is actually for. So this idea of a deterrence agenda in immigration policy, there clearly are 2 agendas at the moment. There's a kind of keep them out type agenda and a slot them in agenda. And I would argue that they're both really about controlling us as a population. But the first, the keep them out agenda, really undermines the second. That's been argued very coherently, I think, by Sylvie Delomba, which is really that as long as you're talking about keeping people out so much, actually it's quite difficult for you then to say, okay, now you've got your papers, so now slot in. It's not, you can't really have the 2 running at the same time. The length of time it takes to get a clear decision on your asylum case and the restrictions that are in place when people are seeking asylum really work against this sort of instant sense of integrating, even when you get your papers. So there's limited access to work, there's no permission to work unless you've had no decision on your case for the first 6 months. You're limited in your studies, you may have to pay as an overseas student, you might be dispersed around the country, you can't bring your family to be with you during the asylum process. And even post-determination, so even when you've got some sort of decision, what Freud would argue was crucial for mental health, the freedom to love and work. Leben und arbeiten, I was hesitating to say it in German, are not really accorded to people, even once they've got their status. This is particularly true now. I don't know how many of you have seen the recent changes to family reunion policy, which mean that in order to bring your wife here, you have to be earning over £18,600 a year. A salary that really isn't possible for a lot of us, certainly not in the sectors in which refugees often end up getting their first few jobs. But if you're not going to allow people to bring family, then they don't have freedom to love. Difficulties with getting employment, widely documented problems with getting employment. It's definitely made worse by the fact that people can't hit the ground running when they're here seeking asylum and start establishing the links and getting the skills they need to start working, and have to spend such a long period not working. That really sort of holds people back. Delays to learning English, particularly if that's restricted, access to courses for a long period of time, there was a restriction that stopped people from doing ESOL. And restrictions to social support. So even post-determination, there might be quite a lot of impact from this deterrent agenda. I've also got here a report from the Migrant and Refugee Communities Forum. I'm delighted that we have somebody who used to work there. And their comment really on this idea, because it's not just about living and working and being here, it's also about participating, being a citizen, and the definition makes that clear. They wrote a paper about political participation amongst refugee communities, and one of the comments they make is, immigration status emerged throughout the course of the research as a significant issue for UK residents without British citizenship, with huge implications for their rights and entitlements, as well as their sense of confidence and belonging. So you may have refugee status, you may have indefinite leave to remain, but you may not participate because of things that are going on to do with immigration status, or because of the negative portrayal of people like you who've been through the asylum process. My second point really is whether integration strategies might hold people back. And this is bringing us into this area where I want to sort of draw a line between those people who really are so vulnerable that they need extra help, and the majority of people who aren't. And it's interesting, I don't think there's anything in the film to indicate whether anybody had any mental health support amongst the people that you interviewed, but it's likely that they didn't. So it's quite important that we check this tendency to describe all refugees as traumatised and particularly vulnerable. Popovic has described this as the new emotionology, this idea that somehow psychological trauma is this enormous thing, and it's the pathway, the passport that entitles you to care. That's the first idea. And then the second idea really is that care has to come from outsiders. Let's bus in a whole load of trauma counsellors to a context of war in order to help. So this sort of idea then that really people are so damaged that they can't possibly get on with their lives without outside help. What it often does, this sort of focus, is takes you away from thinking about whether people need material support, do they need some cash, do they need some food, and whether or not there needs to be political justice. Because as soon as you're focusing on people's individual psychological well-being, you're moving away from an idea that actually there needs to be an action taken about political justice. And it certainly feeds the expert sector, of which I'm one, so I'm very well aware of the way in which being called a refugee support psychologist gives me a job, because obviously all refugees need support. You know, there's a worry there. That's what's being argued. The work of Marita Eastman in Sweden is very interesting in this regard. She had a look at changes to identity amongst Bosnian refugees in Sweden. She identified a narrative about foreignness that associated it with the diversity of social problems, and often made this sort of link, well, they've had war experience, so now they must be traumatised and have social problems, this sort of idea there. Particularly interesting is the report of a study of 11 families from the same rural town who'd been in the same Bosnian concentration camp prior to resettlement in different Swedish communities. In one community, families were offered temporary employment opportunities in the construction sector, while in another, they were given comprehensive psychological services. 1 year on, the majority of adults in the second group were on long-term sick leave. I've heard this paper talked about a lot, and whenever people talk about it, they will say, and the second group were doing fine in their jobs. But actually, Eastman doesn't document that, so I emailed her this week and said, is that true? So many people have said it, is it actually true? You don't actually put it in the paper. And she wrote me back something very interesting, saying that she'd never studied the second community, those who had temporary employment opportunities. They weren't in her fieldwork area. But that really she thought that she'd heard, because they were all in the same camp, she'd heard a lot from the people she was studying about how much more optimistic were the people in construction work, how much more settled they felt. And then she made the argument that really work is this psychologically so important for people. It's something about, not just simply about earning money, but something about being a worthwhile person, being a moral person. And if we overlook that, we overlook the impact of restricting permission to work, we're really missing the point. Popovic has talked about an education into vulnerability, that somehow we tell people you are traumatised and vulnerable and you need extra help to do anything, and they quickly fall in with that discourse about themselves, even though it's actually not a terribly healthy one to align yourself with. And what Marita Eastman put in her email back to me was something about identifying a discourse of deficiency around refugees, and I think that's the same thing. So it's really arguing that possibly having an integration policy feeds into this discourse of deficiency, this idea that people need extra help. So who benefits if we have this discourse of deficiency? Who does it serve? I don't think it serves refugees, although some refugees get caught up in it. it and will come along and present it very victimised, and you may be a lawyer or a psychologist here who sees that sense of victimisation very much enacted by the people themselves. But it certainly serves the interests of integration experts, psychological practitioners, perhaps some refugee agencies whose funding depends on integrating people, and that's a very uncomfortable thing, where you realise that the aid that you're offering may actually be something really quite detrimental if you're not careful with it. Does it serve governments? That's my question. Integration is offered as a vital tool for community cohesion. We will have to be integrated because otherwise we're going to join Al-Qaeda and blow up armed and bust. I mean, there is this sort of rather simplistic way of thinking about it. I also noticed that so many of the discourses around are these sort of migrants as invaders, threats to the established political structure, who need somehow to be controlled. And so then is integration about controlling people, making them fit in, slot in, be like some imagined idea of what a British person is. A last word, so I'm keeping to time, I hope. As Big says, that in a denial of the political and moral capacity of the population due to the traumas and hatreds of war, people are being disqualified from determining their own affairs. Present politics, rather than past trauma, fuels continuing conflict, or we might say fuels continuing exclusion and vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indira and Kate, for that presentation. In particular, I find the video extremely insightful because there is a tendency, and when one asks, well, what's a refugee? One tends to refer to, say, like an Article 1 of the Refugee Convention, a person has a well-founded fear of persecution, etc., etc. Behind these words, there are people, and I thought your video brought home to us the human face of refugees. Thank you very much for that presentation. Can I please now call upon Mary to present?
I might need some help finding my presentation as well. Oh yes. It was a really thought-provoking presentation, just challenging the idea of integration. I'm going to take a slightly different take now and look at how people who've had experiences of extreme trauma in their home country prior to coming to the UK, how these experiences can impact on their capacity to integrate. And I'll give a definition of integration later that I'm thinking about. And similarly, how post-migration stresses can also impact on the capacity to integrate and interact with the trauma that people have experienced and make the whole process very difficult. But before starting, I just wanted to make a couple of opening comments, which I think links into some of what Kate said, is to be very careful about not buying into the idea that all refugees have mental health problems. Being a refugee is not a diagnosis. And there are many refugees who've had extreme difficulties in their home country, who've come here, who've managed to rebuild their lives, who don't have significant mental health problems. And the group I'm talking about is a minority, not the majority. But also, just normalising the experience of exile. Anyone who has experienced exile, it's difficult. There's a period of enormous adjustment, of losses, extreme losses of one's home country, family, culture, and a period of adaptation. And it's really healthy and normal to have a period of grieving, a period of where you might feel very depressed and anxious. We need to be careful about not pathologizing this too quickly. And equally, not pathologizing what can be very normal, seen as very normal social responses to extreme human rights violations by giving the label of PTSD. And Derek Summerfield has written extensively about this, so just a few cautionary words. And similarly, that psychological distress can manifest in many different ways. For example, PTSD might not be the only expression of psychological distress, but people may present with somatic complaints and other ways of expressing their distress. However, holding those factors in mind, there's still significant research, and certainly in my experience as a clinician working with refugees who've had extensive trauma histories, that refugees are at greater risk for mental health problems, in particular for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not going to attempt to go through the sort of various studies looking at prevalence rates because I find them quite confusing, vary enormously. But a meta-analysis done by Faisal et al., who's looked at a whole load of refugee studies, really have come up with the suggestion that about 1 in 10 refugees presents with PTSD. And roughly, refugees on average are 10 times more likely than the general population to have PTSD. That very often this is accompanied by other problems, particularly depression, but it might also be accompanied, they might also present with anxiety or psychosis, other mental health problems. And that within this group, torture survivors are at significantly higher risk for mental health problems, as are people who've experienced rape, sexual assault and traumatic losses. And often people have had all of these events. But again, a word of caution, individual factors are at play and we need to be very careful about not stereotyping and assuming that all torture survivors have mental health problems or that anyone who's not a torture survivor should be fine. There's huge individual variation. Many torture survivors do very well and protective factors are also at play. For example, research has suggested that being psychologically prepared for torture, having a very firm political goal or commitment, having very strong religious faith, these are all factors that can protect and help people following traumatic events. For the purposes of my presentation, I'm going to focus on post-traumatic stress disorder, given that this is the most common mental health problem in refugees who have mental health difficulties. And I thought it would be helpful to try, and it's very difficult in such a short time to really give you an explanation of what post-traumatic stress disorder is. So this is a brief, abbreviated version. Basically, PTSD arises as a result of people experiencing traumatic events, and usually in the case of refugees and asylum seekers, it's multiple events, multiple losses, multiple traumas, and often over a very long period of time. And as a result of this, there are three main categories of problems or difficulties that people can experience with post-traumatic stress disorder. Just before I go on to that, just to define what a traumatic event is. When we talk about a traumatic event, we are talking about an event that involves extreme danger and risk, threats to people's lives, threats to people's integrity, that often overwhelms a person's coping and leaves them feeling helpless and powerless in the aftermath of the event. And as a result, the symptoms that can arise afterwards are the re-experiencing. So this is reliving the event. The person might have very strong flashbacks, sensory images, smells, tastes, whatever, of the actual traumatic events, nightmares that can sort of haunt them every single night, flashbacks of the events. And when these happen, they are experienced often as being very real and very current, as if though they're happening in the present. And there's a real sense of current threat, and often the sort of physical reactions and emotional reactions that they may have experienced at the time of the traumatic event. Then there's the other sort of category of symptoms is avoidance. So people will often work very hard and try very hard not to think about the events, not to talk about the events, to avoid any reminders of things that remind them of what happened. And there's often a kind of emotional detachment and numbing, that kind of an emotional deadness. And I think this is quite difficult when you perhaps are interviewing somebody or taking a statement and they're telling you horrendous events, but with an absolutely kind of cold, detached way of speaking. And that is one of the features of post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as impairments in memory, so not being able to give a coherent narrative, and there being gaps in the story, bits that they can't remember, bits that they remember all too well. And the third sort of category of symptoms is just the kind of sense of increased, well, it's almost as if though the body, although the danger is over and the threat is over, the person physiologically still feels as if though they're in a state of current threat. And this presents as a person being very aroused, and very jumpy, easily startled, irritability, sleep, severe problems with sleep, severe problems with concentration, and just being sort of very, very aroused and unable to really relax and be aware afterwards. So very briefly, that's what PTSD is, and I'll look a bit later about why this is important in terms of how it impacts on integration. But just briefly to think about, I mentioned earlier torture survivors being particularly at much higher risk of presenting with mental health problems. And just to reflect a moment on why that is, what it is about torture that makes it so difficult for people afterwards. And I think if we look at the UN definition, the UN Convention Against Torture definition, there are three features that they really emphasize in the definition. The first is that there's something about it being the deliberate infliction of deliberate infliction of severe physical or mental pain on people with a very specific goal. So it's intentional, it's got a goal, it's deliberate, and it's about severe pain and suffering. Torture is perhaps one of the most extreme forms of trauma you can experience, and in my clinical experience, working with torture survivors and working with non-refugees who've had extreme experiences of childhood sexual abuse, for example, there's quite a lot of overlap in some of the presentation. And there's something in the perversion of intimacy, the perversion of a relationship where somebody deliberately inflicts a level of harm on you that's incredibly powerful and can be very damaging. And I think what it does, and this has been written about by Jan Bullman, talking about the shattering of assumptions, that in order to function as human beings, we all have basic assumptions about other people, and assumptions about ourselves, and assumptions about the world. So the belief that the world is a safe place, that people are not going to harm you, that it's a benevolent world, and that somehow a belief in your own self as somebody who's worthy, got a sense of self-worth. And torture and extreme human rights violations can shatter each of these beliefs, and as a result really impact on people's interpersonal relationships, their relationship with themselves, and the relationship with the world. And Derek Seiler has identified 5 core adaptive systems which he sees as essential for maintaining sort of homeostasis and people functioning well in the areas of safety and security, attachment, justice, one's role and identity in the world, and existential meaning. And torture can impact each of these areas, and for recovery, repair needs to happen in each of these areas. But I'd like you just to hold this in mind when thinking about post-migration stresses. And I would argue that very often post-migration stresses can further impact on each of these 5 areas, making the whole process of recovery and integration even more difficult. I won't go into psychological treatment, but just very briefly to say that when we do psychological treatment, it all involves some kind of reliving of past traumatic events. So we try and help people develop a coherent narrative of the traumas that happened in the past, with the aim of reducing the emotional impact and restoring some kind of sense of safety and control, and helping them locate the events firmly in the past, have some sense of meaning, and also work through feelings of shame, guilt, humiliation that they may have experienced, that they can see themselves as worthy and move on with their lives. There's various treatment techniques, I won't go into that now, but I'm happy to ask questions. But I think what's really important is that you can't do this work if there isn't a basic sense of safety and stability. And again, this is where some of the difficulties people have in this country with housing, with their asylum status, with family reunification, with worries about family at home, it all has a major impact on our ability as clinicians to actually proceed with the trauma work. And we have to do a lot of work first, stabilising people, that's both internally but also in the external environment before we can start doing any trauma work. So again, post-migration stresses and can really stop people making progress in recovery, and hence that impacts on their capacity to integrate in the future. So just to sort of illustrate this, there's a real vicious circle that can get set up with some people where the PTSD symptoms can impact on the person's capacity to find work and make relationships, rebuild their lives here. It also impacts on their ability to cope with the stresses that they face in this country in terms of getting on with their life. The sense of safety and stability is necessary for recovery, so without that the PTSD is just going to continue. The post-migration stresses add to the impact of trauma and are very often experienced as trauma, as further trauma, so you can have a cumulative trauma effect. So just that's a sort of vicious circle, and the less people integrate, the less they are able to work and make relationships. It's just going to sustain the whole sort of vicious circle. I thought it would be helpful, I know Jane, Kate has sort of given definitions of integration, but this was a study done by the Refugee Council at the University of Birmingham, where they interviewed 116, I think, refugees, and just really to ask what they considered important in integration. And through these interviews, they identified 3 main themes in integration, which I quite like to use when looking at the impact of trauma on integration. So the first theme is just functional. This relates to employment, education, housing, language, and this, of course, is the primary concern of most people. The second is subjective and emotional, relating to people's sense of belonging, and this relates to social networks, social spaces, and contact with the local community. And the third aspect is equality, and of course this relates to equal citizenship, equal access to employment, housing, educational rights. And this is really important both for functional, in terms of just being able to do things, get on with life and be safe, as well as symbolic reasons. When you think of all the losses that people have incurred, the threats, the violations of human rights, the denial of equality, this becomes really important psychologically. So just to very briefly look at how these PTSD and post-migration and stresses in the current context here can impact in these 3 areas. And this is by no means exhaustive at all. But in terms of trauma, the re-experiencing symptoms, people have enormous problems with sleep, concentration difficulties, and this of course impacts on one's capacity to work and can often lead to job loss. And I'll give a very brief case example which illustrates some of this in a minute, and can lead to financial problems. Trauma also can create enormous difficulties of people learning English. Loads of our clients just cannot cope with mainstream ESOL classes. They can't concentrate, they can't focus, they go again and again and just really struggle to acquire the basics of language, which of course then impacts on citizenship. If you cannot do the English language test, you have a problem, and no matter how many letters we write, we're usually unsuccessful, arguing mental health reasons for not being able to learn English. And it also impacts on educational attainment. Then post-migration stresses, the lack of choice, problems with housing, employment, education, training, and all of this reinforces feelings of powerlessness. And feeling of powerlessness is one of the central themes of trauma, is loss of control, powerlessness, and this just keeps that whole vicious circle going. There's also the psychological impact of prolonged inactivity during the asylum process, and I think Indira spoke to that as the video, that this is, the need to work is fundamental. We need to have some sort of sense of purpose in life, and to restore some dignity, and with that being denied, it can just reinforce all the feelings that were activated by the traumatic events. and this serves to contribute to social exclusion and marginalisation. On the emotional and social side, trauma, people who've got post-traumatic stress disorder can have a lot of problems interpersonally. If we think about the irritability that can go with post-traumatic stress, the mistrust as a result of all the traumatic events, the difficulty just being with people because of the flashbacks and horrible things going on inside their head. And this can often lead to people becoming quite isolated and socially withdrawn, and interpersonal problems, which will impact on the capacity to form new relationships or to build on things in this country. Trauma can also impact on one's sense of meaning, identity and agency, and can lead to very poor social functioning, social withdrawal, which I've mentioned, apathy and impairment in parental roles. And again, I'll illustrate that with a case example. In other stresses in the post-migration context is the loss of social networks, and again, the difficulties of family reunification and the cost of that, which I've mentioned. One of the most important factors in recovery from trauma, and in fact in recovery from most mental health problems, is social support. And so the difficulties reunification will really feed into that, and it perpetuates depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. The lack of material resources and limited sort of social access to social needs inhibits access to social networks. And very importantly, the exposure, there's been some mention already of the negative portrayal of refugees and asylum seekers, and the exposure to ignorance, discrimination, hostility and humiliation here reactivates trauma memories and feelings of persecution, shame and humiliation that occurred at the time. And finally, in the area of equality, asylum seekers with extensive trauma histories have substantial difficulties in the refugee determination process. And Jane Purley, who's here, has done some research in this area because of their difficulty in giving a coherent narrative of their traumas. And the new asylum model of fast-tracking cases very often prejudices the people that are the most at risk and the most troubled and who are unable to give accurate or give what is perceived to be credible accounts, or to access the support that they need to have their case properly presented. PTSD can also present barriers to people accessing appropriate health care, make it very difficult for them to seek help, often because of the avoidance, not wanting to talk about events. Certainly in my experience in the clinic where I work in, it's a very long journey before people eventually get to us for a whole range of reasons, not least often because they're not picked up by other health professionals. And in the post-migration context, just immigration status, and I think that's very clearly illustrated in the videos, papers. Without papers, there's no sense of safety or stability. How can you integrate? But also this temporary status, people being granted only 5 years to remain before their case is reviewed again, is very, very difficult emotionally, and can contribute to ongoing mental health-related disability. It's a big issue for many of the clients I work with. People do not feel safe until they have their indefinite leave to remain, passport and citizenship. There's always the fear, what if the government suddenly changes the rules and be sent back? And there is the possibility of being reviewed and being returned. So it's very hard to ever feel this is my home. And of course, being forced dependence and marginalisation because of laws related to when people can start working, what access they have to financial benefits, etc., can enforce a dependence and keep people marginalised. I wanted to mention the cost of citizenship. Kate mentioned the cost of family reunification. The citizenship process costs close to around £1,000. And it's something that many people just cannot afford, and it's a real barrier to people actually having the papers that they need to feel safe and secure. And finally, the impact of detention, which has a very significant impact on people and exacerbates other traumas. Many of the clients that I've worked with have talked about how the experience of being detained in this country as part of their asylum process is often worse for them than it was in their home country. And it shatters that hope, that illusion, perhaps, perhaps, that things were different here, that this is the country, human rights are respected, where their needs would be met, they'd be understood, and that's often more damaging than psychologically than the experiences they had in the past. I thought I'd just very quickly use a case, just briefly a case, a woman that I'm working with who, just to illustrate some of the interactive sort of cycle that I talked about earlier, if I could just go back to this. She's given me permission to share her story, and I have to say, although I'm focusing on some of the negative aspects of her story, she's a remarkable woman with incredible resilience who I have enormous respect for, so I don't want to diminish her strength in giving this presentation. But very briefly, I'll call her Grace. She's a woman from Burundi who has had an extensive trauma history, and I won't even try and expand all because it's horrific. It's one of the worst I've heard. But since the age of 9, she's experienced multiple imprisonment, torture, rape, and she's witnessed all of her family being massacred. She arrived in this country, was very unwell, and because of her severe PTSD and her mental health problems, was really unable to negotiate the asylum system and had problems with her asylum application and landed up destitute and homeless on the streets. Whereupon she was unfortunately, she had to work informally and worked as a slave really doing people's housework for scraps of food, I'm sorry to say, in Hampstead. And also was raped in this country. She was very vulnerable, and I think that's just a very clear example of how not having citizenship, not having her asylum needs addressed properly, just perpetuated further trauma and just made her PTSD much worse. She got a fabulous solicitor who sorted things out for her, and she then got her papers and went on to study and became a nurse, and found a partner, had a child, was doing actually amazingly well, when unfortunately a traumatic loss of a second baby activated all her PTSD again and depression. And when I saw her, she had absolutely raging PTSD. Severe flashbacks where she would feel as if though she was experiencing everything again and literally cower under the table, terrified. And this had, and also hearing voices telling her she was worthless, useless, nobody. And it's been so difficult working with her because of the problems in this country, and I'll just mention a couple of them. In terms of the functional areas related to her job and her housing, her PTSD has had a serious impact on her job. She's a nurse, she's making mistakes in medication, her colleagues don't understand her, they started teasing her and calling her mad. She had to take a month of unpaid leave because she was so unwell. She then got into a spiral of debt. She's one of these people who wants to work, doesn't want to be on benefits, is a very sort of minimal wage earner, paying childcare, really struggling. Got into a spiral of debt, and that just kept her depression and her PTSD going. Was living in substandard housing, overcrowded, and with very severe damp, which was making her child very ill. When she tried to go to the council to deal with this, they were quite rude to her, quite abusive to her. She had a flashback to traumas in her home country. They then called the police. Police came, that triggered further flashbacks, of course, to all the persecution in her home country. Police handled it brilliantly. But we've just been dealing with this, we're just trying to deal with the basic phase of getting her to a safe place to start the trauma work, and the housing problems, the issues with money, her benefits were then all cut because she hadn't managed to deal with her affairs because of her mental health difficulties. So it's just really kept the spiral of PTSD going and made our treatment impossible. And on the emotional and social side, her partner has left her because of her mental health difficulties, and she's also having difficulties with parenting because she's so terrified of further loss that she's overprotected with her children, but also very absent because of her constant flashbacks and sort of living in the past. But we've now had to get social services involved and kind of support her in being a good parent. So these are just a few aspects of her life that I think just illustrates the sort of vicious interaction of current stresses on the past and how it's just made her ability to move forward and our ability to move forward in treatment really difficult. but we will get there. She's very resilient and things are being sorted out, but it's still a long journey. So just sort of to sum up then, just to be very mindful when working with people in a sort of legal context or any other context of the interaction between the trauma in the past and the current stresses and how this might impact on integration. That both need to be recognised and addressed. And you can't just wait until the people have got their papers. You need to be thinking about this all along. We need a holistic approach, often involving multiple sort of agencies, and also recognising the person's individual strengths and building on that. And that the past has to be addressed in order to approach the future, and this can only be done within a context of safety and stability.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that fascinating presentation on PTSD. Can I please now call upon our discussant for this evening, Dr. Miriam Chetty. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I probably should start with a disclaimer. I don't have a background in psychology or law. I'm more of a historian initially, and a sociologist or kind of a policy researcher. So thank you for your fascinating presentations, and I'm particularly pleased to hear the kind of the life histories coming in both presentations and the kind of the personal experiences. I'll sort of talk very briefly about both, and just to kind of summarize very quickly some of the key points, and maybe sort of broaden the discussion a little bit more in terms of what we mean by integration, and look a little bit more at the current kind of approach to integration in this country in particular. So the first presentation focused on the integration policy in this country, or the contradictory approach towards integration in terms of a deterrent agenda in immigration policy, so keep them out and then slot them in. So obviously comes across as a quite contradictory, both in terms of control. Well, they have a unified approach in terms of control of population flow, but also kind of bearing in mind the difference, but also sort of wanting everyone to become part of this melting pot, which contradicts also the kind of the UK's approach towards diversity in general. The second, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, but the second presentation, Mary's presentation, reminded us more of the risk, the high risk of mental health problems for refugees, and the role that they play in terms of impacting on this integration process, whether it's in terms of torture or sexual violence. And so, again, although this touches a small, maybe, group out of this kind of refugee population, but still it's quite significant, and it shouldn't be underestimated as part of kind of viewing this integration policy. So I want to take a kind of a step back and look at sort of definition of integration here. And obviously, I think often we sort of mix those two in terms of being a process, but also an outcome. So, you know, and this is reflected in previous and current government policies. I think if we look at for instance, the London refugee integration policy, it's a bit of an extension of the national sort of policy with few exceptions, but the purpose is the same. Okay, and this leads us to think a little bit more about what sort of the different approaches to integration in terms of respecting diversity, but at the same time kind of wanting to develop this shared sense of belonging or citizenship, and so there are various different attempts, and you know, you have to earn your citizenship. You have to prove that you're worthy of your citizenship. So besides speaking the language, you have to demonstrate it in so many different ways. And of course, when you have sort of post-traumatic disorder, or you have, you know, it's very difficult to sort of try and focus on that. And it is that everyday kind of experience that impacts on your sense of belonging. It's not the sort of the final outcome. It is, and that's why we think IPPR, and this is a new approach that we are trying to develop in terms of integration, is looking at it in terms of everyday integration. So looking at how, not just at the final outcome, even if, like, for instance, the media is trying to be positive about refugees or asylum seekers, and as we've seen in the Olympics, with Mo Farah being an Olympic champion, yet the first question that was asked to him is, you know, do you feel a strong sense of belonging to the UK or Somalia? So, you know, you have to confess your kind of allegiance, and this is a sign of whether you're integrated or not. And so it is always kind of looking at the big question and kind of the big picture. How many people identify themselves as British, and how many people identify with their kind of have a stronger sense of belonging with their country of origin. And all this kind of misplaces the focus on how the everyday kind of experiences impact on their process of integration. It's not a kind of a final outcome. It is a continuous kind of process of adaptation. And so we're trying to look at this from a more kind of local level, and focusing on particular kind of interaction sites. And both presentations touch on the question of employment as a crucial kind of first step in terms of helping this process. So looking at some of the challenges these individuals face, or even if they're not allowed to reach that kind of employment space. Looking at public spaces, so for instance, you know, parks or early years kind of provision. These are interaction spaces that might help these individuals in kind of reach a sense of normality. And again, both presentations focus on this. You know, it is, yes, there are some individuals that need help and should be able to get the help they need, but others who just want to hit the ground running. And for many years, while working at the Migrant and Refugee Community Forum, I witnessed all these overseas doctors and dentists who just wanted to practice their profession. And yet, all these obstacles, whether it's a language barrier, whether it's kind of securing the money to sit for the test and take the exam, all these were unnecessary obstacles that not only contributed to sort of a decrease in confidence, depreciation of skills, etc., but just reinforce this image of refugees as dependent on benefits and not kind of needed or having skills that could contribute to the economy and fill some of the skills gap in this country. So I think it is important to sort of not really just focus on this national picture. And although I agree with Kate, I think you know, yes, you often sort of think, why do people need to integrate? You know, why can't we just live you know, our own different ways? And I think more recently, and you've seen in the media, you know, there is a continuous criticism of multiculturalism. And in the past few years, Angela Merkel and David Cameron both declared the death of multiculturalism as being sort of an integration approach that hasn't worked and that has instead contributed to kind of the growth or the development of parallel communities, people that don't share anything in common, people who are, well, divided and segregated communities. This might be maybe true in some areas, but actually, what's more important is that the problem is the inequality within different areas. It's not about sort of whether you have migrant communities totally dependent on benefits or not. So I think any sort of integration, sort of national integration strategy or specific kind of strategy focused on refugee integration should start not with sort of, yes, there is a need to acknowledge the specific needs, but should start with targeting at least two areas that are instrumental in any attempt to sort of secure a sense of normality of life. So, and the first one is employment, as both presentations mentioned. And the second one is sort of mastery of some basic level of English to be able to communicate with others. But more generally, I think integration cannot be addressed in isolation from structural inequalities in society. So from issues that generate persistent disadvantages from some groups in comparison to sort of native communities. And this is why you have continuous tensions within communities, like the working class white British do perceive that there is a sense of unfairness, that migrants and refugees get preferential treatment, and there is this constant kind of tension growing within communities. Very briefly, I think, just see, yeah. So one more point I wanted to make is, I think, in terms of refugee integration, the sort of uncertainty of immigration status being left in limbo for years, and difficulties in accessing sort of basic services are all contributing factors to this sense of isolation, and all contribute in different degrees to sort of impact on mental health and all that. So it is that difficulty to secure a sense of normality in their lives that kind of sets them back in that sort of worse state of. Yeah, I think the main message I would say is that yes, we need maybe some broad framework for integration, but I think most importantly we need a more local approach. And I think local authorities or local institutions do have a key role in contributing to that. And I think a blueprint approach, whether to migrant populations or to areas, isn't going to work. And so I think it's an ongoing process, and looking at integration as an outcome is quite a challenging one, and it should be viewed more as a process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for those remarks. I am very conscious of opening the floor up to questions. Before I do, if I may, could I please invite our presenters, if they wish to, I can give you a minute or so to respond to Miriam if you wish to do so. If you'd like to.
Yes, I mean, just to say that I still don't think we need a policy. but I'm going to, perhaps we can take that further anyway.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Please can I open the floor up to questions? If you do, please raise your hands and I will select you to answer a question. Are there any questions, please? So, I mean, if in that case, if I can abuse my position as chair to ask a couple of questions. First of all, to Indira and Kate, I found this notion of the paradox to be quite interesting, because I think there is a paradox there between, on the one hand, you have a government which wants to keep people out. I mean, the immigration policies tend to be very, very restrictive in terms of having a deterrence element to deter people from coming to this country, so to speak. But at the same time, policy of integration is about including people. So there is this tension in policy when it comes to integration, but on the one hand trying to deter people and keep them at arm's length, but at the same time saying, come on in. So there is a tension there, and I think this tension plays out like this, just as I mentioned it. We want to keep you away, but come on in. So, and I often ask myself how much this is furthered by the notion of integration by itself. So you think of the word integration. What does the word integration mean? To bring something in, to bring them in. Because you're not part of us, we want to make you a part of us by integrating you. And I often wonder to myself to what extent this word integration is a good word to use, and whether it would be replaced by something else like inclusion, or I'm not sure if that would work. So I wanted to ask you whether you think, what's your opinion about this word integration would suggest an element of separation and the other. So that's my first question. So if you think about the word integration, if you're happy with the word integration. And for Kate, I have a separate question, which is this, that I think that in any society, the ultimate relationship that a person has is a relationship of trust with their state. If one looks at, I suppose, basic social contract theory, we have a state who is there, who is in place to offer us protection, to be there for us in case there is any problems. So there's a fundamental relationship of trust between the state and individuals that comprise of that state. So that if the state suddenly turns around and starts torturing you, of course one can see how the individual there'll be a breakdown of trust there between the individual and the state. So, and how PTSD does lead to this break of bond, a sacred bond which I see that exists between the individual and the state, especially when the state is the persecutor. And I think that once the asylum seeker leaves their state and goes to another country for protection, then they have this sort of mistrust. It's often very difficult for them to trust anybody. And I saw this when I was working with asylum seekers, for example, that even though I was there to help them, there would be this element of mistrust. They wouldn't want to disclose certain things to me, or they want to keep certain things to themselves. And when it comes to integration, I wanted to interrogate the extent to which integration policies seek to build up trust with asylum seekers, and don't actually say, well, you're something different. We need to build up a bond of trust there. But at the moment, I tend to see integration policies are more about keeping people at arm's length and not about establishing a relationship of trust. So I wanted to ask to the extent to which you think the current integration policies do seek to build trust up with asylum seekers, but especially bearing in mind where they're coming from. So I'm going to ask you about this word integration, if you're happy with it. Integration meaning we're going to integrate you, bring you in, which are different to us, and the notion of trust. Thank you very
much. I think there's a real difficulty, isn't there? And one of the things that you actually did say, which is very helpful, was about the difference between a process and an outcome. Another thing that's quite important is to ask ourselves whether integration is one-way or two-way. And I think in the discourse of multiculturalism, the idea is that the society is also shaped by those it integrates. So it's a two-way process. People coming up integrated to the society, but the society itself shifts. But actually that really has slipped, I think, and the idea now is about amalgamating, is about slotting somebody into a pre-existing, often a fictional idea of what it means to be here, or what it means to be British or whatever. And that is really problematic when you've got this sort of one-way situation. So the word itself hasn't got a fixed meaning, which is one of the things I was trying to suggest by offering various definitions. And in relation to your second question, I've just pulled out this document, which is the latest from the Home Office about integration, creating the conditions for integration. And it's really quite an interesting document because it's so just school teacherish. You know, on the one hand, it says some good things about disadvantage. and trying to make sure that problems are often caused by general disadvantage rather than trying to target communities. But there is a lot of finger waving, that kind of like, you need to do this and you need to do that. There's a lot of sort of tough tone to it, which actually I can't see the point of if you're addressing adults about adult-related concerns. So there is it's quite problematic. I don't think that the way in which it's being approached currently is grown-up talking between grown-ups. It's a sort of like you need to fit in. And it's very much influenced by ideas about community cohesion, which in themselves are quite problematic. So I don't know if that's a response to your question.
Thank you very much.
Does anybody else want to come in?
Would you like to talk, Mary?
Response to the second question.
This is huge.
About the issue of trust presenting. I mean, I think it's a really important question you raised, because trust is fundamental to relationships, as you say, and belonging, and it is shattered with trauma very often. But trust, just like integration, is a process. It's not something that just happens, that you can just have. You have to earn it, you have to build it up over a process. And I think the language that's used, for example, is very counterproductive. People need to feel respected, need to feel heard, they need to feel valued, and it needs to be given time. And I think any integration process needs to allow for that, and for something that's incremental and respectful and allows for time.
Yeah, I think I just want to go back to the question of your first question. I think, yes, I often find the term integration quite problematic, because integrate into what segment of this society? You know, integrate into a mainstream? There isn't a mainstream. So I think it's, you know, yes, you have adaptation, you adapt to your environment. I think integration is probably better than assimilation. And this is a completely different approach, of course, but I think maybe if I had to find an alternative term, it would be getting along, you know, kind of, you know, not having total ignorance about the other, and trying to sort of build some bridges, not necessarily for you to kind of embrace each other's kind of culture completely, but not to be ignorant of it. And it is about sort of providing the prerequisites to, you know, to be a full citizen, you know, to feel that, yeah, I can go and volunteer in my local area because that's my local area. So, you know, developing those feelings of belonging, but not necessarily because I was asked to. And, you know, I think it's providing the conditions for those to develop, but without kind of saying, if you don't do 20 hours of volunteering, you will never get your citizenship. Or if you don't pass the citizenship test, which often involves learning the questions, then you won't get that citizenship. You haven't proven to us that you know enough about the system to be part of it. So I don't agree with that. But I think there is, you know, it is a two-way process, and it is about kind of trying to bridge some of those differences. And I think, you know, whether it's schooling system, whether it's kind of workplaces, all these try and reduce some of these differences between different communities, and try and, you know, yeah, create some sort of common ground. I know that maybe I'm repeating some terms used by the government, but I do feel that there is a need. I don't think it's helpful to have completely separated, you know, communities that are, you know, that the media is just kind of using to manipulate one against the other.
Can I comment on that though? I mean, we've slipped again into this thing about community cohesion, which actually isn't about refugee communities. It's really important to remember that we're talking about settled communities of 7 generations in other parts of Britain who have had their conflicts or whatever. When you're talking about refugee integration, you're actually talking about communities that I don't think have to, that the bridges don't have to be built in a sort of intervention. And school is a great example. In school it just happens. No one comes in and says we must put a certain number of different kids in this particular class in order to make sure that everybody connects and builds bridges. So there's something quite worrying really when what's being advocated isn't something that's asked of by people born in this country. No one requires me to become civically active. If I want to, you know, do my job and go home and not do anything else and not meet another community, I can. So why a different rule just because I came from overseas? That's really problematic, and I'm worried by it.
Yeah, can I just come back to on that? I think, yes, we're talking about refugees, but a lot of these people, when they were referring to their papers and getting their citizenship, it is about kind of stepping that sort of not being the foreign but being part of this country, and having their citizenship is about becoming British. And so I think at which stage do you, I have to find a way to explain myself, but at which stage do you, because once they have their refugee status, once they have their citizenship, they're part of this community, and I would argue that they've been part of it all throughout, but still they're officially part of it. So yes, I mean, you have, the video that you showed clearly showed people who've come into this country at different phases, and have, they've had the policies impact on them, differently, and made their life easier or harder. So I think the question to you is really, where do you draw the line? I think once,
I think when people get their papers, they go like that, they live their lives without extra intervention. Please.
I think just looking at the current policies and comparing them to the ones in the 90s when I came, first of all, as a refugee, there was no integration policy that was telling me you must do this, this, then this. I did find myself. I found my way through the system. I've learned about things, and I wanted to learn more. And the more I found out about my community or where I lived, the more I wanted to do. The other thing is, often refugees who come into this country, they're not used to the welfare system. I myself wasn't used to the welfare system, and that was the first thing that I was pushed to do, to use the welfare system, to be on social income. And that is something, when I compare back to my country, that is something that is quite shameful and embarrassing. And that can affect you. But also looking at other experiences of people that I work with, I see the difference. The more and more policies that this government produces, especially towards the integration of refugees, the more difficult it's become. How would you expect from Thompson, who have spent 10 years, almost 10 years, struggling with his asylum situation, and then being in prison, he was forced to go into finding job to survive, he was denied status, yet he was left destitute. He wasn't deported, he was fine with being deported, he wasn't allowed to work, and he was in a situation where he had to survive. And then, how do you expect somebody who has spent so many years to now, if you get papers, to integrate into the society, when all he had was bad experience?